Sometimes when you're playing a game, you know there are going to be people that don't really like it as much, but maybe you feel more strongly about some of the subject matter, maybe the gameplay loop, anything about that. And that's exactly how I feel today about Flintlock, The Siege of Dawn. Releasing tomorrow, or today if that's when I get the video out, that's coming from the developer A44 Games, who previously have only made Ashen so far, which was another Souls-like kind of experience, a little more stylized visuals. But it's being published by Kepler Interactive. And if you're curious about the price of the game, that's going to be $40 US, although there is a slight launch discount of 10%. Otherwise, you can get the game on Game Pass, which is really nice. And I have to say straight up that if that's how you're going to be playing this game, I absolutely recommend it. And quite frankly, I recommend this game in general. However, there are some caveats that you may want to consider, like I'm going to buy the game at a lesser price or something along those lines. So what is Flintlock at a base level? So it's a Souls-like game. There is, of course, bonfires or rest points in this game where you can use your skill points to upgrade, and that also resets the enemies when you actually rest there. So that at a base level is there. Now, if you think of difficulty when you think of a Souls-like, then yes, I mean, there are some difficult fights for sure, but it's nowhere near to that level, and it's a far more accessible experience given the wide variety of different weapons, items, and ways that you can kind of cheese or deal with enemy situations. So the way I want to break down this review is in 3 sections. I want to talk about the story, the gameplay itself, and of course the presentation, which is kind of your audio and visuals. So starting off the story, you play as the sapper Nor Vanek, who we meet right as the humans lay siege on Dawn to try and shut the door to the Great Below, or the Underworld. Dead spilling out everywhere in overwhelming force means it was already bad when at the gates a god appears and the seal that held them in is broken. Now that's not the end for Nor, as this was a bit of a redemption story. With a newfound hatred for all things godlike, you find yourself with an unusual companion, and that is a god himself. Enki is a feathery fox that has a lot of charm and a good bit of story to tell. The chemistry between Enki and Nor is a really slow burn at first in a way that I'm not sure works in the earlier bits, but once it gets rolling, it is nothing short of immaculate. Though I have to admit, to get the full effect, you should be doing the side quests to get some little dialogue points between these two characters. And at first, I was actually soured on that. Whether it be learning more about Nor's time serving with the Coalition, or about some juicy god drama from Enki, there's always a nice little tidbit accompanying each side quest at face value. The reason I wasn't happy about the necessity of side quests was that, while completely relevant to learning and evolving these characters, I was worried about the toll it'd take on the main story's pacing. I think the pacing does suffer, especially in the earlier bits. There's 3 major acts to the game, each accompanying a new location. The first 2 are large, semi-open spaces with some need for, linear progression, but an ultimate freedom to go wherever. Think like the new God of War games. While cutting your teeth on the way the game works and how mechanics function, it can be a bit too prolonged in delivering important story beats within that first act, that first major area. But that is if you're doing all the side quests along the way. But thankfully, as the game goes on, the more you know about these characters and the world they inhabit, the happier you'll be. Or sadder you'll be, I guess, maybe. Which actually brings me to how I want to round out the story talk, and that's with the emotions and tone that it goes for. So Flintlock presents itself fairly straightforward as a revenge story, but as time goes on, you'll realize that there's more here than meets the eye. It's a satisfying story that isn't not predictable in its final destination, but it hits all the right beats and secures itself in one of the better lessons that a game can teach you this year. But one thing I will point out, there are so few actual in-game cutscenes or major dialogue pieces within the game. I would have liked a little more, character between maybe some of the camp that you're building up, these characters that are your allies that you can use as upgrades later. And I would have loved just a little bit more heart. You can tell that with this being a $40 game, not $60 or $70, that there was a lesser budget. And it comes through the fact that it takes a really long time to start to feel for these characters. But, like I said, you give the game a chance, you listen to the dialogue, and in my opinion, you will get there. Moving on to the gameplay. So, alright, I've talked a bit about the story pacing, how it suffers, but how it continually gets better. Now, where the gameplay pacing is a bit of a mess almost entirely. In that way, I feel like the game, no pun intended, misses its shot. So, first off, you get these little tutorial screens every few seconds for the first half an hour of the game. Super annoying, gets in the way of everything. I know they have to show you, but there's just so much thrown at you all at once. Thankfully, it's not that hard to remember. But this is a Souls-like game. You've got your melee attacks, powder weapons. You've got your quick primary weapon, which reloads its charges over time as you do damage. But then you've also got limited use secondary fire, which this is going to be your, your rifle, your cannons, and your larger weapons that you only have a few bits of ammo for that you can't refill until you go back to a rest point. And I can talk all day about how this game is a streamlined version of the Dark Souls combat, and I think it's best to just say that where in Dark Souls you may have to go and buy new grenades or find them within the world to fill out your character's, stash of them that you can throw at enemies, in this it resets every checkpoint, which is both nice, although you do have a lesser capacity overall. You can increase these, you can upgrade pretty much any item you use throughout the game if you do wish. There's resources like sulfur, wood, iron around the world, which is really nice. But one way that I think that this game is streamlined in, I would say a better way given the experience, there's a lot of different meters you're having to look at, is the fact that there is no stamina within the game. That's just not a thing. You have the ability to dodge and basically double dodge or double jump with the powder jumping abilities that you get from Enki, and in that way the game works really well. Instead of being limited by the stamina combat system, you're rather limited by the animations. And there's a good bit of, canceling abilities or attacks mid-swing, things like that. It feels responsive and it feels good, so it doesn't feel overly punishing. But I will say that those dodge windows, if you're going to be doing perfect dodges, wanting for iframes, I did have a hard time finding that threshold. So in that way it's good, but you're not overly punished at any points throughout the game. There's a couple tough enemies, but as long as you're leveled efficiently, you'll be fine. So in that way, I feel like the game is very, new player friendly. There's obviously different play styles that you can go for. There's 3 upgrade trees. There's your gunpowder abilities, your magic abilities, which are Enkis, which I'll get to in just a moment, and then of course your melee combat abilities. And as you put points into each of these, they also build up a damage threshold of how much damage you do by percent as well. But I really like the combat system. As I said, Enki is the one bit that reminds me once again of God of War. He is kind of like your Atreus. He's the one that you hit Y or triangle with, and he's actually going to attack your targeted enemy. And he can build up these, based on what kind of gem you have him imbued with, different curses or, poisons, different things like that to break down armor, health, anything to kind of turn the tide of battle in your favor. And he can also taunt these enemies, and if you upgrade them, he will stagger some enemies for you. It's really helpful, and I love that system. In my opinion, Enki, between, actual gameplay use and combat capabilities, is my favorite aspect of this game. He's kind of like the main character, and that's totally fine. He's really just Atreus, but not annoying. But okay, I've talked about the actual combat mechanics you can use, but let's talk a little bit about what you're fighting. So you've got a decent variety of enemies. One thing I'll say as far as pacing goes, it does stagnate. As you get further and further into the game, you're getting introduced to less and less types of enemies, and because you're basically battling an army of the dead for the most part, they feel very samey. Now, there are other enemies throughout the game. Of course, there are bandits, deserters, different things like that. And so there are excuses to have some enemy variety within the game as well as some, wildlife across certain environments. But I was really disappointed by how few enemies were actually introduced in the later parts of the game. Another thing in terms of pacing, and this is really minor actually, is the traversal of the game. Well, it's not minor, but it's major at the same time. So, 2 things. First off, platforming. I think it's fine. I think it kind of blows its load really early with the powder jumping abilities. You can jump around the world basically doing double jumps, triple jumps with your dashes and things like that. And the game does use these for its platforming. It's very platforming heavy. You're going to be climbing, jumping around a lot, doing different things. And I think it works well. I just wish that there was a little bit more of a progression to it, maybe a couple more abilities that you can unlock later in the game. I wish there was more, maybe even like a long glide or something from high points. You're always on high vistas in the game. On the inverse of that, when you are just running around the world, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's hey, we don't want you to get through the game too quick. It does feel like Nora runs just a little bit too slow. Like her animation, it just seems like she's running so slow for how fast she's going. But if they sped it up, it seemed like she needed to go even faster. That being said, the final bit I want to talk about with the gameplay were the boss encounters. Now, there are plenty of different health bar style arenas throughout the game. Some of these are hordes of enemies that they have one shared health bar. And those are cool. They freshen up gameplay. You've seen those in like Dark Souls 3, for example. You've seen those before. And I think those work, but I think they're a little overused when I could have used a little bit more variety in the actual boss fights themselves, like the major god boss fights. There's only a handful within the game, and I think they feel varied enough. I really do. I think they're fun to fight. I think it's cool to see them in like their different arenas, things like that. But what I would have wished for is probably an extra boss fight here or there. Now that could just be me, but that's what I would have liked to see. Oh, and another thing, I didn't even talk about how you actually get your, souls, or as they call it, reputation in Flintlock. So it's actually a really cool system, and probably one of the most redeeming qualities of the game for me, because it plays like an action game. In some of those character action games where you actually get rated like per combat encounter, like A+, S+, or if you're Drake, A minor. Anyway, instead of having those type of ratings within the game, it goes simply as this. Say you defeat an enemy, you get that base reputation for him, you get those base souls level. However, based on how many different combos you use, the variety of different abilities employed, that actually builds a percent multiplier. So say you got 100 souls off of killing a guy, but you did so good, and let's say you've got a plus 15%. So as of right now, until you get hit or take damage and that resets, you could cash out for 115 souls instead of, that. Now, both of these numbers are stored in a bank. So until you cash out your souls or you get hit, that 100 souls from the enemy is going to stay out of your bank. You could kill 3 enemies as long as you haven't been hit yet. You could say build it up to 300, and then by then maybe it would have went up to 30%. In which case, 30% of 300 rather than 15% of 100 is a lot more to add on. So you can see the risk to reward of not cashing out your reputation right away. Do I feel this system is entirely necessary given the normal or even the easy difficulties? No. But it's a really cool extra challenge to the game, and there's even some achievements for it. But where the story is pretty good, I think the gameplay is just alright. It's serviceable. It's very user-friendly, and in a lot of ways, I think that will turn some people off. But again, that's, to me, we've got serviceable all around here so far. But finally, the last thing I really want to talk about was the presentation. So, visually speaking, this game looks really good, and it runs pretty good as well. At max settings, I was playing at 2K on an RTX 3070, AMD 7 something, I don't remember. Anyway, it ran pretty good. All I had to do was turn DLSS on quality mode, and I was getting, 80 frames regularly. However, I did have probably 3 or 4 spikes during high intense battle scenarios where my frames dropped to 20. I don't know what happened here. I don't know if maybe a driver will fix this, so I'm not putting too much emphasis on the, performance of this review. But yeah, I don't know what happened there. It was super annoying. But again, this game looks great visually. There's plenty of particle effects around the screen. There's a good bit of animations to see throughout the game, whether you're disarming an enemy, doing an enemy takedown, or just the actual swings and movement around the world. However, it does get a bit repetitive as you're going throughout the game. You're going to hit those thresholds of like, hey, I've seen this 100 times already. And once you're in the game for a while, that's when you start to notice things. For example, I've got this village here. There's no noise in the background. There's no white noise. There's no, hitting of a door or anything. It's like Euron Greyjoy came to this village, cut out everybody's tongues, and, made them take a vow of silence. Like, this game is great, but there's definitely some rough edges presentationally as well. And sound design is mostly where that's at. I feel like some of the sounds and sound mixing are a little off. There's stuff that's super loud, stuff that's not loud at all. Some voice acting sounds like they're whispering into the microphones, where some characters are like yelling. And I chop that up to, hey, it is what it is, but at the same time, auditorily speaking, this game didn't really draw me in. There was a couple great music pieces throughout the game at set piece moments, and I think those worked well. And the boss fight music did their job, but I don't know. From a sound standpoint, I wasn't the biggest fan. Now, I think the main characters, Enki and Nor's voice acting, as well as the sound effects on the gods' voices, were actually quite good. So again, I think they nailed it where they needed to, but there could have been a lot more to shore up the defenses, if you would. The environments within the game look great. The character models for a lot of the main cast, and even some of the side cast, look pretty good. I found myself keep trying to use the photo mode, and I think the photo mode's serviceable. I think you could have done with some, poses or something for Nor, rather than just whatever you pause it on during the gameplay. but it really does a good job of showing just how beautiful this game and world can be. Talking a little bit about the level design, I know this is kind of more of a gameplay thing than anything. I like the way they do shortcuts within the game. You've got these rift jumps around the world. I'll show some gameplay here. You've seen it in trailers, of course. And basically you activate a skull and you can open up these, sometimes it's a path forward, most of the time though it's a path backwards in case you die, and you can get there faster without, skipping a lot of the enemies. So in this way, I think some of the linear areas are pretty intuitive, though I think when this game tries to go wide in its environments, I think it kind of falls apart a little bit. It's just boring. Like I said, Noor runs a little too slow, and the enemies and enemy variety in those sections just dull out a lot. Another thing when talking on the traversal of the game that I wanted to really point out is that there's so many nooks and crannies within this game that if you're going to challenge yourself and try to get somewhere out of the way, the game always rewards you. Generally, it's not with chests or any larger items like that, but usually you're going to find these little items that you can sell to get some extra reputation. So that's really cool, and I love that Flintlock actually allows you a little bit of extra freedom when moving around, and I'm glad it actually rewards you for it, so it doesn't just feel random or wasted. So with that being said, after about 13 hours with the game, I didn't get every achievement or anything. They said it'd probably take about 20 hours for that. At about 13 hours, $40, I don't know, maybe just wait for a nice little discount. Maybe about that $30 range sounds perfect to me. Otherwise though, if you have Game Pass, this is an absolute no-brainer to me. I think this is a fun game, and it's fun to play. It just asks a little bit more from you than what a AAA game would. So with that being said, thank you for watching. My name is fallinghurts. If you liked this review, if you thought it was fair, consider subscribing. And if you didn't, well, fuck you. No, I'm just kidding. I love you. Goodbye.